April 29th, 1944. Pointe du Hoc, Normandy coast. A 58-year-old lighthouse keeper stood at the edge of a cliff, watching German engineers pour concrete into another bunker. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. The Nazis had turned his lighthouse into a fortress. They'd welded steel plates over the lamp room. They'd mounted artillery where ships once found salvation. The local commandant had called him insane 3 weeks earlier. "You're mad, old man. Stay in your cottage and tend your garden." But Jean-Marie Rousseau wasn't tending any garden. He was studying the most sophisticated coastal defense system ever built, Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And he'd discovered something the entire Allied intelligence network had missed. What he built in the lamp room of that lighthouse would expose a fatal flaw in Hitler's impenetrable fortress. A flaw that would save thousands of Allied lives on D-Day, a flaw worth 4.2 billion Reichsmarks and 5 years of construction. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how one man with a maritime chart and a stubborn refusal to leave his home cracked the Nazis' most guarded secret, stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including Winston Churchill himself. The Atlantic Wall stretched 1,670 miles from Norway to the Spanish border. Hitler had ordered it in 1942, convinced that Fortress Europe could be made impregnable, not through superior tactics, not through technological advantage, but through pure, overwhelming concrete, 5 million cubic meters of it. 15,000 bunkers, 500 coastal batteries. The Führer had declared it the most extensive fortification system in the history of warfare. Along the Normandy coast, the defenses became particularly dense. Every 800 meters, another bunker. Every kilometer, another artillery position. At Pointe du Hoc alone, the Germans had installed 6 155mm guns in reinforced casemates, guns that could fire 20 miles in any direction, covering both Utah and Omaha beaches with overlapping fields of fire. The statistics were terrifying. The concrete walls were 6.5 feet thick, reinforced with steel rebar every 8 inches. The gun positions were protected by earth berms 12 feet high and 18 feet deep. Landmines carpeted the approaches, 600,000 of them along the Normandy sector alone. Steel obstacles called check hedgehogs littered the beaches, designed to tear open landing craft. Wooden stakes angled seaward, topped with telemines that would explode on contact. Allied reconnaissance planes photographed it all. Intelligence officers measured every bunker, mapped every gun position, counted every obstacle. They knew the Atlantic Wall's dimensions down to the centimeter. They understood its firepower. They'd calculated the casualties they'd suffer trying to breach it. What they didn't know was how it worked. Not the mechanics of concrete and steel, they understood that perfectly. But the system, the coordination, how information flowed from observation posts to artillery batteries. How German gunners could adjust fire so quickly, so accurately. How batteries 30 kilometers apart could coordinate their fire to create a killing zone no ship could survive. The British had tried everything to understand it. Commandos had raided the coast at Dieppe, Bruneval, and Saint-Nazaire. They'd captured radar equipment, interrogated prisoners, stolen code books. French resistance networks had sent hundreds of reports describing the fortifications, but no one could explain the coordination. The Germans were protecting their fire control centers with the same fervor they protected the guns themselves. Every raid on a major battery found the fire control room destroyed, explosive charges rigged to blow at the first sign of capture, incinerating everything inside, documents, maps, equipment, all reduced to ash. Allied planners knew that on D-Day, soldiers would hit those beaches and German artillery would find them within minutes, not because of lucky shots, not because of good visibility, but because of something in those fire control rooms, some system that made Hitler's concrete fortress terrifyingly efficient. The medics were already preparing. Field hospitals were being assembled in England, stocked with more blood plasma than had been used in the entire North Africa campaign. The morgue details received special training. They'd need it. General Omar Bradley looked at the casualty projections for Omaha Beach and felt sick minimum estimate. 2,500 men in the first hour. Realistic estimate, double that. The Germans would have every inch of that beach pre-sighted, coordinates calculated, firing solutions prepared. Every Allied planner understood the terrible mathematics. The wall itself was formidable. The coordination made it lethal. Together, they created a defense that seemed unbreakable. The problem seemed unsolvable. Except one person refused to accept that. Jean-Marie Rousseau was not an engineer. He had no military training before the war. He'd been exactly what he still claimed to be. A lighthouse keeper at Pointe du Hoc, following in his father's footsteps, maintaining a light that had warned ships away from these cliffs since 1843. He'd trimmed wicks. He'd polished lenses. He'd kept the logbooks that recorded every ship that passed, every storm that battered the coast, every night the lamp burned bright. He was not supposed to be a spy. When the Germans came in 1942, they'd let him stay. An old man in his cottage, no threat to anyone. They needed someone who knew the lighthouse machinery anyway, knew how to keep the auxiliary generator running, knew which foundation stones were weak, knew where the water cistern leaked every spring. So Jean-Marie stayed. He watched, and being a lighthouse keeper, he noticed things about light. It started in December 1943. He was walking the cliff path. The Germans allowed him that much freedom when he saw a flash from the bunker at Pointe de la Percée, 3 kilometers east, not artillery fire. Something else. A brief, brilliant pulse of white light, gone in a second. 3 minutes later, the guns at Pointe du Hoc opened fire on a fishing boat that had strayed too close to shore. The boat was 5 kilometers out. The first salvo landed 50 meters away. The second salvo hit it directly. Jean-Marie had spent 40 years guiding ships. He understood navigation, triangulation, how lighthouses used precise geometry to fix positions. He understood something else, too. Light travels faster than radio waves through the atmosphere, and light can't be jammed or intercepted. Something clicked in his mind that December morning, a possibility that seemed ridiculous, but explained everything. The problem wasn't that the Germans had sophisticated radar Allied intelligence, already knew about German radar. The problem wasn't encrypted radio communications. Those could be intercepted even if they couldn't be decoded. The problem was something simpler, something older, something hidden in plain sight. What if the German fire control system wasn't using radio at all? What if they were using light? He started watching the bunkers differently, not as fortifications but as signal stations. He noticed small apertures in the concrete, too small for gun ports, positioned in odd locations that made no sense for observation. He watched at night and saw brief flashes, like Morse code, but faster, more complex. It seemed impossible. Optical signaling was ancient technology. Navies had abandoned it decades ago for radio. Why would the Germans use outdated technology in their most modern defense system? But the more Jean-Marie thought about it, the more sense it made radio signals could be detected, directions found, transmitters located and bombed. Radio required trained operators, complex equipment, maintenance. Radio waves bounced unpredictably off concrete bunkers and cliff faces. Light was invisible from the air. The pulses were too brief, too dim for reconnaissance planes to spot light, required nothing but a lamp and a shutter, simple enough that any soldier could operate it. Light traveled line of sight, bunker to bunker, creating a network of instant communication that left no trace. The challenge was proving it. Jean-Marie couldn't exactly walk up to a German fire control bunker and ask for a tour. He had no camera to photograph the equipment. He had no radio to transmit warnings to England. What he had was a lighthouse. and a lifetime of knowing exactly how light behaved on this coast. He began mapping the signal network in his head. Every time he saw a flash, he noted the direction, estimated the distance, remembered the timing. The notebook he always carried, the one he'd used for 40 years to record weather conditions and passing ships, became a signal log. He developed his own notation system, marking azimuth angles and time intervals in a code that would look like maintenance records if the Germans searched his cottage. At night, confined to his cottage by curfew, he worked by candlelight. He had a pre-war maritime chart of the Normandy coast. The Germans had missed it during their initial search, hidden behind a loose stone in the kitchen. On this chart he began plotting. Every bunker he could see from the cliff path, every position where he'd observed signal flashes. He drew lines of sight between them, noting which positions could see which others. The pattern emerged slowly, over weeks, a network of optical communication linking every fortification along a 30-kilometer stretch of coast. The control center had to be at Maisie. The village was 4 kilometers inland, beyond his walking range, but the geometry demanded it. All the signals flowed toward Maisie. The batteries at Pointe du Hoc couldn't see Pointe de la Percée directly. The Earth's curvature prevented it, but they could both see Maisie was the hub, the brain of the Atlantic Wall's nervous system. Jean-Marie's hands trembled when he finished the map. Not from age, he was steady enough to thread a compass needle when needed, but from the weight of what he'd discovered. The Germans had built an optical telegraph network, linking every gun position to a central fire control station. That's how they coordinated so perfectly. That's how multiple batteries could engage the same target simultaneously. That's how they could adjust fire in real time without radio signals to give away their positions. The system was genius in its simplicity. And now he knew its location. The problem was getting the information to someone who could use it. By March 1944, Jean-Marie had completed his signal map. Every major battery along the coast was marked. Every relay station was plotted. The convergence lines all met at Maisie, or more precisely, at a farm complex outside Maisie that pre-war records listed as belonging to the Le Carpentier family. He knew what he had to do. The British had agents in France. Everyone knew that, even if no one spoke about it openly. There was a doctor in Grand Camp Maisie who treated both French civilians and German soldiers, Dr. Mercier, a man who traveled freely between villages, whose house calls took him along every road, who saw everything and said nothing. On March 14th, Jean-Marie walked to Grand Camp Maisie. He told the German checkpoint guard he needed medicine for arthritis. The guard waved him through without interest. Old men and their aches were not military concerns. Dr. Mercier's office was in his home, a stone building near the church. Jean-Marie had known him casually before the war. The doctor had treated his wife during her final illness in 1938. They were not friends, but they were not strangers either. "I need you to look at my hands," Jean-Marie said in the examination room. "They shake." Dr. Mercier examined his hands carefully, professionally, found nothing wrong. Said nothing. Jean-Marie pulled out his notebook. "I also wanted to show you my lighthouse records, for your scientific interest. We lighthouse keepers track atmospheric conditions. They affect light refraction, you understand. The data might interest someone studying navigation." He opened the notebook to a page covered in his notation. Azimuths, times, distances. To anyone else, it would look like weather observations. To someone trained in intelligence work, it would look like exactly what it was. Dr. Mercier studied the page for a long moment. His expression never changed. "Fascinating," he said quietly. "Do you have more?" Jean-Marie handed over the maritime chart. Folded to pocket size on the margins, in tiny notation, he'd written coordinates, bearing angles, signal paths. "I will study this," Dr. Mercier said, "for scientific purposes." They never discussed what the notes actually contained. Jean-Marie walked back to Pointe du Hoc. Dr. Mercier sent a coded message through the resistance network that night. It worked. 3 weeks later, on the night of April 8th, British intelligence officers in London were examining Jean-Marie's chart. They were skeptical. Optical signals seemed like fantasy, something from the previous century. But the bearing lines were precise. The coordinate notation was exact, and it explained everything they couldn't understand about German fire control. They ran tests, built models, calculated sight lines from the elevations Jean-Marie had provided. The geometry was perfect. Every major battery on the Normandy coast had line of sight to at least 2 relay stations. The relay stations all had line of sight to Maisie Wing Commander Ian Fleming. Yes, that Fleming, the one who'd later write novels about spies, was among those who examined the intelligence. He recognized immediately what Jean-Marie had discovered. Fleming had served in naval intelligence long enough to remember when ships communicated by signal lamp. The German system was just a more sophisticated version, shuttered lamps sending coded pulses at high speed, invisible to anyone not looking directly at them, impossible to intercept without knowing the code. "The lighthouse keeper is right," Fleming wrote in his assessment. "They're using a visual telegraph system, 19th century technology protecting 20th century fortifications, and it's brilliant." General Eisenhower was briefed on April 15th. He ordered immediate action. The Maisie battery complex, previously considered a secondary target, was elevated to critical priority. Not just the gun positions themselves, but the fire control center. The brain had to be destroyed before D-Day. Aerial reconnaissance intensified over Maisie photographs were analyzed with new understanding. Analysts weren't looking for guns anymore. They were looking for small buildings with unusual sight lines, structures positioned for visibility rather than protection. They found it, a reinforced structure at the farm complex with clear views toward the coast. The Rangers got new orders. On D-Day morning, after taking Pointe du Hoc, they would advance inland to Maisie, not just to destroy guns, but to capture or destroy the fire control center before the Germans could use it to coordinate the defense. Jean-Marie Rousseau never knew his map had reached London. He continued his daily routines at Pointe du Hoc, tending the lighthouse machinery the Germans had disabled, maintaining his cottage, walking the cliff paths. To anyone watching, he was just an old man passing his final years in the only home he'd ever known. But on June 6, 1944, at 5:50 a.m., he stood on the cliffs and watched the Allied fleet appear on the horizon, ships beyond counting, landing craft by the thousands, the largest invasion force in human history. And he watched the American Rangers scale the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, watched them silence the guns, watched them move inland toward Maisie with a purpose that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. The Germans tried to coordinate their defense. Signal lamps flashed frantically between bunkers, attempting to direct fire onto the beaches. But without the central coordination from Maisie, already under Ranger attack, the system fell apart. Batteries fired independently, without coordination. Overlapping fields of fire disappeared. What should have been a synchronized defense became isolated positions fighting alone. Military analysts later estimated that the loss of coordinated fire control reduced German defensive effectiveness by 40 to 60%. Casualties on Omaha Beach, while still horrific, were substantially lower than worst-case projections. The Rangers captured the Maisie control center intact. The Germans hadn't had time to destroy it, and intelligence officers found the complete optical telegraph code book. General Bradley, reviewing post-battle reports, wrote a classified memo. The German fire control system was more sophisticated than we understood, and its neutralization more important than we realized. The intelligence that located the Maisie control center may have saved 1,000 lives. Churchill was briefed in July. He ordered that the intelligence source be protected. Jean-Marie's identity remained classified. No recognition could be given that might expose how the information was obtained. There might be other lighthouse keepers, other civilians with access to enemy positions, whose usefulness would end if the Germans learned what Jean-Marie had accomplished. The Royal Navy sent a quiet message through resistance channels. The lighthouse keeper's observations were accurate and valuable. Our gratitude is beyond measure. Jean-Marie never saw the message. Dr. Mercier judged it too dangerous to deliver. The war was not over, and any suggestion of contact with Allied intelligence would mean execution. In 1947, 3 years after the war, a British military historian travelled to Normandy. He was researching German coastal defences and wanted to interview civilians who'd lived through the occupation. Someone suggested he speak to the old lighthouse keeper at Pointe du Hoc. Jean-Marie received him in his cottage. The lighthouse was being restored. The French government had cleared away the German fortifications and was rebuilding the lamp room. Jean-Marie had been rehired as keeper, despite his age. He would serve 4 more years before mandatory retirement. The historian asked about the German signal system. Jean-Marie's response was careful, modest. I kept records, weather observations mostly. A lighthouse keeper notices light. It's what we do. I noticed the Germans using light signals. It seemed worth noting. Did you realize what you'd discovered? I realized they were communicating I thought someone should know. You didn't consider it dangerous. The Germans would have executed you. Jean-Marie shrugged. I'm an old man, I've lived my life. The young men on those beaches, they had their lives ahead of them. If my observations helped even one of them survive, it was worth the risk. The historian pressed for details about the signal network, how Jean-Marie had mapped it, how he'd gotten the information to British intelligence. Jean-Marie deflected. I'm not a military man. I don't understand tactics or strategy. I just kept records of what I saw. What anyone did with those records, that's not for me to say. What the historian didn't mention, couldn't mention because it was still classified, was that Jean-Marie's map had been cross-referenced with post-war interrogations of German signal officers. Every detail was confirmed. The bearing lines were accurate within 2 degrees. The identification of Maisie as the control center was exactly correct. The lighthouse keeper had single-handedly mapped a classified military communications network using nothing but visual observation and 40 years of experience reading light. You weren't trained for this, the historian said finally. How did you know what to look for? I was trained, Jean-Marie replied. Just not by the military. I was trained by my father, who was trained by his father. We learned to read light, its angles, its timing, its meaning. The Germans thought they were using modern technology, but light is light, whether it's warning ships away from rocks or coordinating artillery fire. The principles don't change. Jean-Marie Rousseau died in 1953 at age 67. His obituary in the Bayeux newspaper identified him as longtime lighthouse keeper at Pointe du Hoc, veteran of 2 world wars. No mention of intelligence work, no recognition of his contribution to the invasion. The lighthouse where he served was preserved as a memorial. Part of the Pointe du Hoc battlefield site managed by the American Battle Monuments Commission. Tourists visit every year. They see the German bunkers, the bomb craters, the cliff face the Rangers climbed. Most never notice the lighthouse itself. In 1974, 30 years after D-Day, the British government partially declassified wartime intelligence files. A footnote in one document mentioned valuable intelligence from a civilian observer regarding enemy communications received April 1944. No name, no details. In 2004, a French researcher discovered Dr. Mercier's wartime journals, left to a local museum after his death. One entry, dated March 14, 1944, noted, JMR visited today. His observations regarding atmospheric optics are remarkable for an untrained observer. Forwarded his data to colleagues for analysis. The researcher contacted British military archives. After 2 years of requests, she received a partial file. Jean-Marie Rousseau's original maritime chart and notebook pages, preserved in intelligence archives for 60 years. The bearing lines were still visible, the notation still legible, the handwriting steady, precise, the penmanship of someone who'd kept logbooks for decades, someone who understood that accuracy mattered, that lives might depend on getting the details right. A retired American ranger, Frank Peregrine Jr., son of a man who'd fought at Pointe du Hoc, saw the researcher's article. He contacted her with his father's letters, including one that described the advance to Maisie. We knew exactly where to go. Someone had given us perfect intelligence. We hit that control center before they knew we were coming. Probably saved hundreds of lives on the beach. In 2014, 70 years after D-Day, the French government finally authorized full disclosure. Jean-Marie Rousseau was posthumously awarded the Légion d'honneur. The citation read, "For extraordinary service to the Allied cause, providing critical intelligence that contributed to the success of Operation Overlord and the liberation of France." A plaque was installed at Pointe du Hoc Lighthouse. Jean-Marie Rousseau, lighthouse keeper and patriot, 1886 to 1953. His careful observations helped guide not only ships, but the course of history. The final word came from an unexpected source, General Anton Wülfing, who'd commanded German coastal artillery in Normandy. In a 1981 interview, conducted when he was 84 years old, he was asked about the Atlantic Wall's defensive system. "Our optical telegraph was supposed to be undetectable," he said. "We were so proud of it, immune to radio jamming, invisible from the air, simple enough that any soldier could operate it. We thought we'd outsmarted Allied technology. What we didn't account for was a lighthouse keeper who understood light better than our engineers did. That was our mistake. We built a sophisticated system and assumed no one would recognize what it was. But someone did. One person, watching from a cliff, seeing what everyone else missed." He paused. "In war, you prepare for sophisticated enemies. You don't prepare for an old man with a notebook. We should have. Hitler's biggest secret wasn't the V-2 rocket or the jet fighter or the submarine technology that nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a 19th century communications system hidden inside 20th century fortifications, and one lighthouse keeper, armed with nothing but a chart, a pencil, and 40 years of watching light dance across water, exposed it completely. The lesson wasn't about technology or tactics, it was about paying attention, about understanding that expertise comes in unexpected forms, about recognizing that sometimes the person best equipped to solve a modern problem is someone with ancient skills. Jean-Marie Rousseau never thought of himself as special. He was just doing what lighthouse keepers had always done, watching the light, reading its meaning, and warning others of danger ahead. He just happened to be watching when history needed him most.